Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Gloria Edwards, and I'm the director of the Southern Rockies Fire Science Network. We're a chapter of the National Joint Fire Science Program, which is a collection of 15 fire science regional exchanges across the United States, Alaska, and Hawaii. And we are charged with understanding and being a catalyst for the facilitation of exchange of wildfire knowledge and science between researchers, managers, and communities to help move fire forward and improving land management decisions with sound science and management. Also like to acknowledge a partnership with the Southwest Fire Science Consortium. Rachel, you want to pop on? She's here on behalf of the Southwest. She's our tech person today, thank you for the Zoom account. So she'll be moderating our chat, and we'll be doing some fancy switching back and forth between screen sharing and video playing, and we're hoping it all goes smoothly. I'd also like to acknowledge the Arizona Wildfire Initiative, funding and support, USDA Forest Service, and I think that's most of our cooperators. We'd like to have a statement that explains the purpose of the video and a little bit of the background and what really got this going before we segue into viewing. In traditional wildfire discussions, we often frame fire as the enemy and firefighters as the sole heroes tasked with stopping it. The simple fact is that the more we suppress small fires, the more devastating later fires become, and this is known as the wildfire paradox. Plus, science has shown the importance of fire in maintaining forest health and preventing larger fires. This conflicting narrative makes it difficult to convey the role of fire, both as a problem and as a solution. A more effective approach would be to shift the focus towards the condition of the landscape and the communities themselves, encouraging a collaborative effort using various tools such as fire, mechanical thinning, risk analysis, and risk reduction. This approach would involve partnering with different groups to address the underlying conditions and improve outcomes for wildfire management. All wildfires demand a response, and fire managers must ensure the response is commensurate with the values at risk, resources available, and firefighter safety. The San Juan Forest managed several fires in 2023 to reduce risk to fire personnel and public using indirect tactics. And those tactics and the development and outcomes are what we would like to highlight in this brief video today.
We use a very militaristic language in firefighting, which sets up this context for the conversation of winning and losing.
The culture there is like, we're going to get people out there and get it done. We got to change the context from can we to should we.
We have other options out there. We don't have to just go headlong and suppress something right away.
There are different ways to fight fire. It's all about the right strategy and the right place and the right time.
Through much of the 20th century, the default response to wildfires was to keep them as small as possible by putting them out as quickly as possible. Firefighters going direct. Even now, this response remains central to firefighting strategy, but even if it works,
when we take actions, they have immediate and long-term impacts, right? And so when we're choosing to suppress fires at the smallest footprint, we know by doing that, we're not addressing the long-term issue of fuel accumulation and hazardous fire conditions.
We're starting to think about things from a bigger picture and looking at what is the deferred risk. If we put a fire out now, sometimes we still just hit that easy button and then put a fire out when maybe that's not the best answer.
The fire on the east side here is held up above the creek.
in 2023, the San Juan National Forest responded to a succession of fires using a variety of tactics. One approach, on land where fire was previously suppressed, allows naturally caused wildfires to begin to restore some ecological balance. Such fires also help protect communities and infrastructure by reducing the potential for future high-severity wildfires. One of these lightning-caused fires was carefully suppressed by using previously established prescribed fire boundaries.
Dry Lake Fire was a great opportunity for us to take advantage of the right conditions coming together with the right pre-planning, with the right people in place.
Dry Lake also fell within some much larger boundaries that had already been identified as a network of best available fire control features. These are usually made up of roads, trails, and waterways and are called pods.
These are potential operational delineations, which is using control features that are going to be more manageable for fire resources.
And so the long-term risk reduction is by allowing these fires to come out to these predetermined boundaries, we're able to reduce that fuel load on a larger landscape. And when you piece all these landscapes together, it's how we start to combat these large wildfires.
One key to success is burning when temperatures aren't too hot and the fuels aren't too dried out. With good conditions, crews were able to carry fire across 1,400 acres in about a week, mimicking the prescribed burn they were already planning in this area.
And what we're doing now is bringing the attitude and the mindset around prescribed fire into a wildfire response posture. And I feel like that's a natural evolution that we need to embrace more and more.
Many tree and plant species have evolved by adapting to fire. Low to moderate intensity fires encourage their growth and create forest openings where wildlife can more easily find food. The South San Juan Mountains were the site of another lightning strike, which became the Quartz Ridge Fire.
Pretty remote, rough terrain.
What kind of the resources we would need for those actions?
Fire managers now have a suite of risk analysis tools to predict wildfire growth and guide the response. Those tools help them decide that Quartz Ridge and a second remote fire could be managed without taking direct suppression actions.
You know, we're trying to make that shift away from always feeling like we have to go direct, even when we know it's not a good idea. It's been ingrained in us for so many years.
Steps were taken to protect private property closest to the fires, just in case. Even with great analysis, careful monitoring, and lots of hard work, any fire can become a threat as conditions change. Having fire on the land always poses risks.
And we have to own it. We have to be transparent in our communication about the fact that we are dealing with these events. They're not perfectly predictable.
For the San Juan National Forest, what's been effective in communicating to our public and to our partners and learning from our partners, because it is a two-way street, is taking the time to have the meetings, build the relationships, invest in the process with collaboratives and stakeholder groups far in advance of implementing tactics or strategies that people may or may not understand.
What we need people to understand now is that on fires like Quartz Ridge, you won't see a steadily rising containment number because that's not the measure of success for all fires.
We just have to dig into the true meaning of the work that we're doing and explain why, so that people stop looking for that containment number and start understanding that the goal may be to see this thing through till the snow flies.
So, we acknowledge the risks, impacts from smoke, and temporary loss of access to public lands. But the problem of our changing forests is too big to ignore.
So if we can start to separate this win or lose scenario and talk about the gradients in between, because there are obvious impacts and lots of benefits.
If it's the right time and place, we have to do it. Because we're never going to be able to effectively manage our landscape or effectively manage our fuels if we don't take those opportunities when they come up.
Here's a recap really quick of the video highlights that we would like to have as key takeaway points. Number one, invest in stakeholder engagement. This facilitates communication, builds trust, a shared sense of responsibility and ownership and teamwork. Be prepared. Collaborative planning supports proactive wildfire management. Planning tools and processes build shared understanding over time and smoother operations. And building local capacity is an outcome from all of these efforts. Identifying opportunities across space and time, thinking in terms of landscape scale instead of isolated incidents, or perhaps I would add separate properties. Time. This year's large incident is next fire's best holding feature. There's lots of science to support that. Focus on risk, tools, processes, and communication. Framing wildfire around risk creates space for nuanced response options and decision-making. Produce visual information that facilitates cross-boundary communication during collaborative processes, and it supports transparency, inclusivity, and consensus building to make things smoother and better outcomes for communities and land in the future. Provide clear intent and consistent direction. So we'd like to now introduce our first panelist, Josh Peck, who's the district ranger of Pacosa District of the San Juan National Forest. And we'll be speaking about aligning land and fire management, setting leaders' intent, working with incident management teams, and building relationships. Josh?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for being here and giving the San Juan an opportunity to talk about some of the fires that we had last summer and what we learned through that process. I might go slightly off script from what Gloria said I was going to talk about, but we'll try and touch some of those. No, my fault, not yours. I did want to talk just a little bit more. First off, I've been the district ranger here in Pacosa for about 3 years now. Spent a little time as a deputy district ranger down on the Coconino National Forest and Flagstaff, and then have bounced around the rest of the region 2, spending time in Wyoming on the Medicine Bow Route National Forest and Thunder Basin National Grassland, and then up on the Black Hills is where I started my permanent career. Throughout that time, I've spent time both in the operational side of fire management as well as participating in incident management teams, mostly on the planning side of those teams. So just a little background. I do want to talk just a little context. We got a short clip of the video, and the longer video I think talks a little bit more about the entire fire summer we had, and we had roughly 7 managed fires of large size on the forest, starting in late June last summer and running all the way through basically November. And I was part of 5 of those fires as both the district. There 5 of them were on my district, so I was the district ranger involved, but also the agency administrator on 5 of those fires. And for those who are somewhat unfamiliar with the command structure with fires, the agency's administrator is kind of the decision maker that delegates authority, provides intent for the incident management teams. So it's not often you get to in one summer have a fire at the beginning of the summer, analyze the decisions and thought process made on that fire, and then get to employ it throughout the rest of the summer and really change course of action and see the impacts of that in one season. So that was kind of unique for us that we had this Chris Mountain fire, learned a lot on that, both personally and I think as a forest, about how we can better manage those fires. And we're immediately able to employ that about 2 weeks later, going into the Dry Lake fire over on the Columbine district. I think, for us, I didn't set out, I don't think any of us in the video set out to have this, have a camera put in our face. this last summer and record ourselves. None of us, except maybe Lo, the public affairs person that we'll talk in a little bit, likes to speak in front of a camera. So I don't think that our intent was ever to be like, hey, look at what we're doing down here. But we had folks that thought we had a story to share, and there were some threads of conversation to pull in these videos. And we saw some in this short video related to reduction of long-term risk on the landscape and communications, and there were some others in the longer video really relating to how we make decisions and utilize the tools available to us to help us contextualize and communicate that. I think the last thing I'll say, I really am kind of in a position where I'm pretty humbled to be here. I don't consider myself any sort of expert speaking in this regard. And so the opportunity to just share some of that personal story with everyone and really use it as a catalyst to continue the conversations we need to have around these topics is a great thing. And I'm very humbled to be here. And so with that, I will, because I want to get to the question and answer portion, I will pass it on to my counterpart, Pat Seekins.
All right. Thanks, Josh. Yeah, I'll introduce myself and can I do a little bio, a little bit of background. So I'm Pat Seekins. My current day job is the Prescribed Fire and Fuel Program Manager for the San Juan National Forest. Been involved in fire management for over 24 years. Started my career in Arizona on the Coconina National Forest as well. A lot of valuable lessons learned down there, but I've been on the San Juan National Forest for the last 9 years. And also been a participant as an operations section chief on one of the Rocky Mountain area complex incident management teams. So that's been a great experience, kind of as a background on what we'll be talking about today. So I'll kind of start things off a little bit about landscape scale prescribed fire planning and what we've done on the San Juan National Forest. I would say over the past 5 years to kind of set up for success. We've got over 650,000 acres of allowable landscape to implement prescribed fire, which has allowed us to be more strategic on where we plan for those planned prescribed fire ignitions across the landscape. It allows us to move around and be flexible and really set us up for success for that implementation. And obviously that has to happen when the conditions are right and very favorable to meet our objectives with those prescribed fire treatments. But where that leads us, it leads us really naturally right into our proactive fire management approach here in the San Juan. Not just with our leadership, but line officers, fire management, and the intention to make sure our firefighters understand our overall strategy. When we get the opportunity, a great opportunity with a natural ignition wildfire, where we can be strategic and we can really invite our key stakeholders and partners to the table to really help us validate our strategy once we propose that on where we're going and why. And the why is the most important piece, which leads us to utilizing a process called the Incident Strategic Alignment Process, so formerly or currently known as the ISAP process, so another acronym. Anyways, it's a great process, and I would say it's although we call it a process, it's more of an approach that we take, and it's very collaborative, where we're bringing in all our key partners with operations, with our incident commanders, with our federal and state partners, fire protection districts. Once we've kind of developed a draft strategy, we want to share that strategy, and we want those local sheriffs. We want those folks to help us identify things maybe we've missed, to help identify what we call critical values at risk, like what is out there on the landscape that we want to protect. And that's why we're there. We want to focus on where we can be successful on either slowing down the spread or where firefighters can be successful with the least amount of risk to the responders. So when I say responders, those are the firefighters that we're asking to implement our strategy, our chosen strategy. So it's a very important process. It's centered around 4 things. We want to identify the critical values at risk. That can be homes, infrastructure, obviously power lines, communication towers, private land. We want to identify those in the landscape. And then we develop and build our strategy around that. And when we do that, we've identified those. There's no surprises. We can brief to the firefighters, here's our chosen location, and here's why we chose this strategy and location to protect these values. And there's a lot of science and analytics that have come about, I'd say, over the past 5 years that really help us validate that strategy. Not to say that we look at the landscape and choose a strategy and we think we're good. We also have that science and analytics to back up that strategy. And those analytics and kind of science-based models have been very effective for us in the San Juan National Forest, as well as on complex incident management teams to help us develop a strategy. And so those analytics that I'm talking about all exist in a public-facing database called the Risk Management Assistance Dashboard. A lot of us call it the RMA dashboard. Those analytics are key. They've been super important to us and very user friendly to toggle on and off to help us steer the direction on where we want to place our control lines on a wildfire incident. It gives us color coding that relates to suppression difficulty index, potential control locations, and then another very important kind of proactive fire management tool we've been utilizing that was developed really across the Forest Service. Most forests have in place are what we call the potential operational delineations. Really call them pods for short, obviously another acronym, but a very important tool that's developed by local fire management. So those potential operational delineations are developed locally. So local fire management developed those, and it's probably a good place to start looking for those control features. They may be existing road systems, trail systems, rivers, natural barriers that have been identified, and that all exists on the Risk Management Assistance Dashboard as well. So with all those tools and kind of that strategic management approach, from the prescribed fire side moving into the wildland incident side, it just blends together and sets us up for success. And we've been able to practice that over the years here on the San Juan National Forest and been successful. Obviously, we've learned a lot through some of that process, as Josh mentioned, and really wanted to utilize all the tools in the toolbox to set us up for success and to get to that point of telling the firefighters, our stakeholders, why we chose a certain strategy. And it just helps us be transparent with our public, with our firefighters, our responders. And it's got to go up and down. So that communication is very key. So with that, I think I'll stop right there and I'll wait for the Q&A at the end. So I'll go ahead and pass it off to Tracy Milakovic. She's the Fire Management Officer in Pagosa.
Hey, thanks, Pat. Appreciate it. And hey, everyone. I appreciate being here. I am Tracy Milakovic, District Fire Management Officer for the Pagosa Ranger District here on the San Juan. I've been here for almost a year in this job. I came from the other side of the forest. Previous to this job, I was the operations AFMO in Dolores for just over 4 years. And I've been in wildland fire for over 20 years, working on other forests in Colorado, the PSICC, the Rio Grande, and now the San Juan. So I'm here to speak about my perspective of operational risk as a district FMO. So if you look at the basic definition of risk, and there's a couple different definitions out there, one being a situation involving exposure to danger. There's to do something that might result in loss or failure. Another way to define risk is a measure of the probability and consequence of uncertain future events. So if you take all those definitions at face value and overlay them onto wildland fire, it's some heavy stuff. And it's a lot of responsibility that's put on us as fire management. To make it relevant to this discussion, I've got a few talking points that it might end up seeming more like a string of consciousness, but they do apply to how I viewed and handled operational risk this past season with everything that we had going on with the large fires that we had, the multiple large fires that we had. So first, I'd like to talk about risk responsibility. So what does that mean in the world of fire management? So we, as fire managers and really as people managers, we're ultimately responsible for what we ask our folks to do. And for the most part, our folks put their trust in us to help make the right decisions. To me, the question I ask myself first, before I ask someone else to put themselves out in front of danger, is, are the potential outcomes associated with the actions we're going to ask our folks to take out there, whatever they are they worth the end state? Is the potential loss or harm to values at risk or to themselves worth the effort? Is the success, which usually comes down to protecting something, which is lives, homes, land, timber, viewsheds, watersheds, even public trust, is that worth putting our folks in front of that danger in order to keep the status quo of that value? To me, it's a balance of tolerance, achievable results, suppression strategy, right place, right time, taking advantage of opportunities. So with that said, really the onus is on everyone at that point. We all own the risk. We're all responsible for critical thinking at that time and for speaking up when something isn't working or if conditions, hazards, et cetera, change. Something else that runs through my mind, whether we're using ISAP, which Pat mentioned, or another risk management tool, is are we using the best available information to drive our decision making and how we perceive our risk with purpose? Or are we looking at values at risk, and is their true value commensurate with what we're asking our folks to take on? And also, do we have enough resources to take on what's being asked? And if not, how do we prioritize? Are we digging in, using the best available science and information and tools at our disposal? Pat also mentioned the RMA dashboard. Are we using ground truth observations, collective experience? So one example I could use from this past season is handling the Quartz Ridge fire versus the Trail Springs fire. Two sets of different management strategies. They were both very successful. We used all the same tools to manage our operational risk with these fires. We went about the management of them differently due to them being such different fires in such different areas with different values at risk, or not many values at risk depending on the case. Something else I think about that always comes up when we start talking about alternate actions to direct attack or multiple strategies in a fire versus just full suppression, is how do we rate or determine exposure? Do we have 20 people performing a high-risk operation for a shorter period of time versus 200 people performing a lower risk operation for longer duration? How do we know what is more acceptable? How do we figure out what is necessary or unnecessary exposure? So we had to decide with every fire this past season what was acceptable exposure for our folks, and we had to get that buy-in. And it was pretty different for each one. There were multiple factors that went into every decision. So yeah, not only do we have to consider the situation, but there are human factors to consider too. Comfort level, experience levels of folks involved, along with everything else. So yeah, to kind of wrap it up, when we when we talk operational risk, our responders are our most valuable value that we have, for lack of better words. So we do our best to give them the best available information for them to do their jobs, to keep the flow of communication both ways, and to give them decision space to do their work, hopefully with the knowledge that they have our ultimate support from us. So, and thanks. That's all I've got for now, and I'll pass it on to pass it on to Dana, who will be speaking to you next.
Great, thanks, Tracy. I have a few things to say. So far, you've heard from staff on the San Juan National Forest. I am not a U.S. Forest Service employee. My name is Dana Guinn. I'm the Southwest Partnership Manager at the Forest Stewards Guild, which is a 501c3 nonprofit, a small national nonprofit with its headquarters in Santa Fe. We work to practice and promote responsible forestry to sustain the integrity of forest ecosystems and the communities that depend upon them. I'm also a Pagosa Springs resident and a collaborative coordinator and facilitator in the area. So I do a lot of work with the San Juan National Forest, and especially when it comes to connecting with communities. So I have a few things to say that are transitioning us more to the communications and values realm. So the first thing that I'll say, and people that know me, this will sound really familiar, but a commitment to collaboration really is a forever commitment, and you are keeping the door open to ongoing dialogue in perpetuity. I'll also say that in times of uncertainty, especially when there's an active wildfire incident near a community, that personal connections are so meaningful, and being able to use plain language about the actions being taken and why is really important to building those connections. And I think ultimately, you know, what we do here on our landscape and the way that we treat one another really matters. Like the why that Pat was talking about should already be familiar when we're in these types of situations. So a lot of this is about, you know, we think about getting in there and taking action. But for me, a lot of this is around intention and mindset and your service ethic and relationship with community. So being able to plainly tell the truth and listen to other people's truths, managing expectations realistically, and then, you know, especially in a public service role, being able to ask tough questions of yourself, know your biases, and be reflective in an effective way, I think matters a lot. You're in a position to be interfacing with the public and with communities that have strong ties to these landscapes. And in some cases, these areas are a core part of people's identities. And I think that when we have that dialogue, we create productive discourse. We can ask one another to get a little bit uncomfortable, think about those assumptions and biases, and create ways forward together so that we do truly have shared ownership and understanding. And we are creating, instead of asking partners to tell a story or pinning it on the U.S. Forest Service to tell a story, instead we are, it's our story together. I think the us-them language can be really challenging sometimes, and it's confusing to know what your role is in that, especially when we talk about shared responsibility and shared risk. That can be really unclear and confusing. So another thing I'll say, but specifically around the fire season last year, is that giving credit where credit is due really matters. And I want to give some credit, you know, to leaders and decision makers that have an appetite to change their mind and to take responsibility for outcomes and understand when and where to take risks. And I think that in all reality, you know, asking hard questions of your community, and then that are free as possible from preconceived notions, and then looking for support where you might not expect it, like being healthily skeptical, but allowing yourself to still be surprised by the type of support and dialogue that can come from your community, is really important. So I guess, hopefully I'm not sounding too stream of consciousness, and this is a little bit value-based, but in practice, it really matters to just make those personal connections in times of uncertainty. And I think that ultimately, we have to have, all of us, our community members and decision makers and incident managers, have to have the humility to accept that what we've done and thought before sometimes isn't the right thing to do right now. And I think it's really powerful when we have the ability to change our minds and to take ownership of our own learning and to share that back with others. So that's what I have to say. I mean, in terms of access to decision making and the understanding of the why and that kind of co-creation of reasoning, collaborative spaces are a great way to do it. They also aren't the end-all be-all solution. Having those individual relationships, making personal phone calls, understanding who those kind of spark plugs are in your community, whether or not they're involved in a formal or informal collaborative space, is really important as well. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Lo Williams before we have some Q&A later.
Thanks, Dana, and thanks everyone that's spoken so far. I'm apparently, according to Josh, the one that loves being in front of the camera, which isn't true, by the way. I just really think that a lot of people want to have this discussion, and judging by the 91 folks on the call, there are some people that want to have this discussion and talk about everything from risk reduction to resource benefit fire, managing fire. And so I really appreciate the other panelists who let me rope them into this. Thanks, you guys, because they're not public speakers as the first, duties as assigned for their positions. And so they're coming out of their comfort zone to talk to this group today. And I really appreciate it because I know that's not easy. So my name is Lorena Williams. I work on the San Juan National Forest. I'm a communications specialist, and I'm also a fire public information officer. I was one of the public information officers assigned to the Dry Lake Fire, the Quartz Ridge Fire, Bear Creek Fire, Trail Springs Fire, and some of the others that were burning on the Columbine and Pagosa Ranger districts last year that were highlighted in the longer evolution and thinking video. I also want to say there are two sort of evolution and thinking videos. A lot of you have seen the full 20-something minute video that really gets into the full breadth and depth of the 2023 fire season. What was shown at the beginning today is brand new. You're the first to see it, public-facing video that was, instead of being geared more toward fire managers, is geared more for public consumption. And so that will officially be released here in the next week by the San Juan National Forest. And shout out to Andy Lyon, who is the filmmaker of both of those videos in partnership with the Rocky Mountain Research Station, who identified the evolution and thinking concept and identified the need to make a video and start having more of these public and practitioner discussions about the work that we're all doing. And so thanks to the Rocky Mountain Research Station and thanks to Andy for making really quality content. And we've gotten a pretty strong response from both the public and practitioners and agencies on those videos. A lot of people are raising their hands and saying, we've been doing this kind of work for years. And, that is the case in some places, though it's not necessarily the case in Region 2. And so on the San Juan, we have felt, while we're not the tip of the spear in terms of, managed fire, we are doing something that a lot of Region 2 hasn't had the opportunity to dive into yet. And so in our Forest Service region, this was the first real opportunity that we've had to tell the story. And I think that the more we all tell the story, especially our counterparts in Region 3, Arizona, New Mexico, where this type of work is accomplished all the time, the more we can tell the story, the more we can normalize the discussion, both within our own internal groups and with the public. And that is really important because there are a lot of communications challenges. And I guess I have felt like there are a lot of communications challenges with talking about managed fire. And judging by the poll results, and that other people are so interested in how to communicate out on this, I'm seeing that I'm not alone and feeling like this is a challenging topic to discuss. And for me, the key challenges, again, as a fire information officer, as someone who's responsible for creating the INSEE web posts or the Facebook and Twitter posts, who's responsible for talking to media, I need to have really packaged, clear messaging when I'm talking about either reducing future wildfire risk or current wildfire risk to responders, and resource benefit fire. And we've been for decades really focusing on two primary topics: prescribed fire and wildfire. And Nick Glidden, one of our district rangers, during the video talks about, you know, we have these two ends and we need to start looking into that gray area in the middle and talking about that whole spectrum. Because as you saw in the evolution and thinking video, there are times where we're implementing indirect tactics because it's too risky to send responders in. We're no longer going to just dump retardant on fires that we can't staff because it's so risky to put them in where spruce or lodgepole are falling left and right. So that's a scenario that is a little bit easier to communicate with the public. It's too dangerous, period. We can't engage. But then there are some situations like with the Dry Lake fire last year where the lightning fire started in a prescribed fire unit. And we had a little bit of a challenge communicating that while the fire started in a prescribed fire unit and we're using indirect tactics to suppress it at a larger footprint, it is not a prescribed fire. And we get into these really technical details that quickly sort of surpass the attention span of a lot of our public. And people aren't necessarily going to read past the first paragraph to get, or the first sound bite in a video to get the real nuanced information that we need to communicate for them to understand what we're doing. And so I think for me, what that's led to is wanting to engage in, well, a panel discussion like this, wanting to engage with stakeholders, as Dana said, wanting to engage with our local collaboratives, because we can't only tell the story when the fire is burning. In fact, if we start telling the story when the fire is already burning, we are so far behind the curve that we're never going to catch up in reality. And so that stakeholder and collaborative engagement is a 365-day, and as Dana says, lifelong commitment, because this messaging is complicated. And in order to be fully transparent with the public, we need all of our partners to help with the messaging, to talk about risk, to talk about fuels reduction and resource benefit and why fire is important on the landscape. And that can't happen when there's smoke in the air. People are too caught up in the catastrophe. And I know for those of you that work in information, this is all very familiar. I want to talk a little bit about some of the specific communication strategies that we've been employing, and none of these are new. We haven't invented anything that's going to blow anybody's minds, but with all the interest that was expressed in the communication side specifically, I thought I'd throw out some specific examples. Well, one is that you can do field tours to some of your past, whether prescribed fires or managed fires. Tomorrow, actually, on our Columbine Ranger District, we're doing a field tour of the Dry Lake wildfire, which was a managed fire inside a prescribed fire burn unit. So those tours can be really helpful to get public and stakeholder engagement and to get your community leader buy-in, because your sheriffs, your county leadership, in order to really get behind you as an agency, and this is me speaking on the agency behalf, to get those other community leaders buy-in, it really helps for them to see what you're doing. And then when the next time comes that you have the opportunity to manage a fire, or you've chosen to manage a fire with less of a direct approach because it's really putting firefighters at risk, you have the support of those community leaders around you. And part of that community is also here in this panel discussion. And again, it's all about just spreading the word and talking more about this as we're doing it. So field tours, that's one way to really start communicating out the nuances of the work that we're doing. Work with your collaboratives and stakeholder groups. Well, we have really strong forest health collaboratives in Southwest Colorado that are extremely engaged and meet monthly, if not sometimes weekly, host these field tours, develop video content, share our messages out, share each other's messages out. Not everybody has those collaboratives, but everybody does have some sort of stakeholder groups, whether it's watershed groups, whether it's your Trails Roundtable. There are all kinds of organizations in your communities that you can get involved with and tell that story. And that's the easiest and cheapest way to really get involved and make these stories familiar. Other ways, if you can find the funds, creating videos. I mean, there's no doubt the evolution in thinking video was not developed in a 40-hour work week. That thing took some serious time and investment. And so not everyone can throw together a 22-minute video, but those 30-second clips during a wildfire event that has a good story to tell, making sure you bring in PIOs that can do that. Social media, obviously, pressing on those partners to help tell the story. But I guess I'll wrap it up because I'm sure that I'm pushing my 7 minutes. For me, working on the San Juan National Forest, the leader's intent that I've received from my forest supervisor is really to be transparent, and to be transparent from the very beginning. We're using language like fire managers are evaluating options for managing a lightning fire. We're saying it up front, once the fire is identified on the ground. We're talking about the indirect tactics that we're using to suppress the fire and reducing fuels for risk reduction now and in the future. We're trying to use the technical language and trusting our communities and our public to do the legwork and understand what we're saying. And we're erring on the side of more information rather than less. And the folks that aren't interested will, see the picture, read the first couple sentences and disengage. But for folks that really want to learn about these processes, they have the opportunity to understand what we're doing, and it builds trust with that transparency. But transparency also comes with at least perceived risk, if not, some risk to our reputations as agencies and individuals. And that's where, again, we have our partners and our stakeholders around us to support us because we've been engaging them over time. So we don't stand alone. So be transparent. And, I hope that this Q&A brings out some additional ideas as well as really good questions. And so I'm going to pass it on to Gloria. And thanks everybody for being part of the community that's discussing a lot of this nuance. Appreciate your time.
That was great, Lorena. That was a lot of information and a lot of great advice as you share the San Juan National Forest experience in this transition and feeling that it's an evolution in thinking as well as process. One of the big questions that a couple of people asked was about your San Juan National Forest plan. How old is it currently? When are you due to rewrite it? And is it, with these assessments, risk analysis, did you find it adequate and helpful, or was it restrictive? I suppose that's for Pat and Josh.
Yeah, I mean, I'll take a stab from a fire management perspective. All the forest I've worked on in the past 24 years where I was focused on the forest plan anyways, I would say. The San Juan sets us up for success. The plan gives us a lot of flexibility to allow fire in the landscape on a majority of the forest, outside of wilderness, but it still speaks to that. And so the forest plan is not very old. It's fairly new compared to a lot of other forests, and it definitely gives us that flexibility for not only planned events for prescribed fire, but leading into fire across the landscape from natural ignitions. And in fact, it encourages that.
Josh, did you want to tag on to that?
Sure, I'll answer the first part of the question. That our forest plan was last revised in 2013, and that was we used to be a service first forest. That was a split between us and the BLM at that point. And so in regards to forest plans, ours is considered just a baby compared to other people's, even though it's 10 years old. From a decision-making standpoint, I really find a lot of flexibility in our forest plan, the way it's written for fire management, for different objectives. And, the barriers that really come up in fire management, I think, are perceived tolerance from the public. That seemed to be the barrier that I needed to overcome in particular. So I really think the way our forest plan is written, it stands to really be opportunistic rather than restrictive.
Okay. And that segues into the next question that someone posted, that you talked about how in hindsight, it's easier to see certain fires like Chris Mountain that were approached with direct suppression strategy as maybe a missed opportunity. But you also laid out all the factors that went into the decision at the time. So this kind of focus that zooms in on the leadership pressure and how to make decisions in your situation. How do you pull back in that crucible that you're experiencing to see the bigger picture and identify potential opportunities to grow the operational box and pull in all the choices while it's happening when you're under a lot of pressure, especially from interests and the public?
That's a lot in that question.
Yeah,
I'll
but
try and tackle that one.
yeah, but we'd like to, I mean, it's not the easiest job in the world, be a district ranger, and
It is
especially
not,
major
and
wildfires.
it is not. And I think, in my response to this video, or my portion of the video where I'm speaking, is really mostly I think intended towards my fellow district rangers, my fellow agency administrators, because it does get kind of lonely sometimes when you're holding that risk, really. And you share some of it with an incident management team or with your fire management folks, but and you really hold most of that risk. And so that can be an uncomfortable position when you're thinking of not doing or not having the normal reaction to a wildfire of, we're going to try and put it out at the smallest possible footprint. And I do think, there's that, you play that scenario in your head, the what if game. Okay, what if it does move beyond where, it's predicted to go, and we have, it moves across the divide onto the Rio Grande National Forest, and they have a bunch of houses and things, right directly across the divide. And that's the hard part about being in a decision-making position, is playing those games in your head and getting past that, to know that you're accepting that risk, and you have people. There's more people that I think understand and support that than you originally think about in the moment. I think, for me, that process this summer was less an evolution in thinking, where I knew in my head what we needed to do, and my landscape's a little different over here. We have a lot more mixed conifer and topography to manage, and a lot less control features on the landscape. So, when we're talking about ignitions in our higher country, we're talking about likely, unless we go after it aggressively, we're talking about longer duration fires, and that's what we saw this last summer. So, for me, it was less a like changing the way I'm thinking, but aligning, the heart and the mind, perhaps, where I think we as line officers feel like we know what the right thing to do is, and just really having the ability to tolerate that risk. I think some of the tools that are starting to be developed are really trying to help contextualize, and I'll say, the ISAP and the strategic risk assessments help contextualize what we're talking about in that trade-off of those decisions, where I'm like, and we made a decision on a fire this summer that was a relatively small fire, but the responder risk was almost off the charts relative to our values at risk, but we made that decision in relation to, the political atmosphere that we are in. We had several fires burning already, and we made the decision to put that fire out and take on that risk. But to me, it's more of alignment of heart and mind at this point, and building courageous leaders, maybe, which is a challenge for the agency and something that we need to embrace.
Since you mentioned building leadership and challenges for the agency, I'm going to hop down to a couple questions. How do you see the challenges with firefighter recruitment, retention, sustainable mental and physical health intersecting with the need to reevaluate our traditional 10 a.m. approach to fires? Anybody?
Tracy, I think that's your cue, maybe.
You're the one with the fire cloud in the back, so.
Yeah, that's a really tough one, because there's so many other factors that go into wildland firefighter retention and recruitment. I think it's the best way to put this. I think give me a second here to gather my thoughts.
We can come back if you want. There's plenty of other questions.
Yeah, no, I think I'll try to tackle this one. I think it's bigger than what we're doing as far as fire management, but I guess I can see that coming into play as well. For me, I guess I just speak for myself, and I think there's probably others out there too that maybe feel the same way that I do. This different approach, this evolution of our thought process on managing fires and handling fires. I've got a passion for my job, and I think now that we're leaning into looking at different strategies, long-term strategies, risk reduction, that kind of gives me a renewed passion for this job. And I would hope that our up-and-coming fire leaders, from the GS3s on up, are seeing the same kind of changes, and it's kind of given them, it's rekindling maybe some more passion in them as well. And maybe the folks that are thinking about making it a career or thinking about applying for a fire job are seeing the ways that we're starting to manage fires, and they're seeing that it's a positive change, and it's a step forward for us, for landscape management, for risk reduction for firefighters, and to me, I hope it would be a boost for retention and a boost for recruitment, instead of just going back to the old 10 a.m. policy, smash every fire and then be done with it. But maybe this gives people hope that we aren't just kicking the can down the road with every fire, but we're trying to do the right thing out there. So
great. That's good. We're hoping in all kinds of systems, especially in Colorado. I'm not sure if our out-of-state visitors know. I believe that Colorado instituted a free community college education for people going into wildfire and forestry management specifically, as well as education and nursing and a couple of others. But it was seen at the state level as something that was needed enough that the state needed to subsidize the entrance of that into a lot of careers. So I'm sure hoping that would have a lot of bearing on it as well. Shifting a little bit to some of the technical support. How instrumental are the tools that Pat mentioned, such as Risk Management Assistance Dashboard and ISAP, which I'm sure it's in here. Can you spell out ISAP? ISAP stands for Incident.
Yeah, Incident Strategic Alignment Process.
Okay, those tools, Incident Strategic Alignment Process and Risk Management Assistance, proven and you're supported in your evolution of thinking. And there's some other questions about communicating the success of previous fire scars as control features, and some other things. So some technical, how useful are these tools in making these decisions?
Yeah, I'll start that off. Really, I would say at the local and the forest level, let's say like a local complexity, local resources managing, all the way up to complex incident management teams at the national level. Very helpful. And I'll say, you know, the A in ISAP is probably the most important piece where we talk about alignment. When we have alignment with our agency administrators, our line officers, our leadership, our collaboratives, our stakeholders, our partners, things seem to happen quickly and efficiently where we can make a decision on a strategy and therefore communicate that down to the ground and then get that validated and ground truth, meaning the firefighters buy into what and how we built that strategy. And then we're able to tell them and give them the why behind why we chose that strategy. And if they can come back and tell us this is a doable strategy and they feel like the risk versus gain is acceptable and that's agreed upon, and we're in alignment with our agency administrator who ultimately kind of has a say on whether, you know, go, no go, we're good to go, right? And so that typically happens early on in the incident, and that's the key to a successful ISAP process or an approach is we're getting that done up front early on in the incident, and we can communicate that all the way down. The other benefit of ISAP and utilizing the RMA dashboard with all the analytics to back up and validate our strategy is that when we have long duration fires and multiple incident management teams transitioning in and out over months, and we see this happen quite often, not just in Colorado, but the Pacific Northwest and elsewhere, where they have, you know, 4 or 5 incident management teams. Typically, if you've done the ISAP process and evaluated the analytics up front with that first incident management team, the strategy is intended not to change over space and time. And that's been key and very successful and proven, especially over the last couple of years.
Good to know. That's great. More questions coming in. We've had some questions around smoke. And I've.
Lorena, do you want?
Yeah,
Do
go
you
ahead.
want me to jump in?
Yes, go ahead.
Great. So we've had a couple of questions about smoke, basically asking, how can you communicate to the public, and what answers can you give now about how the potential impacts of smoke from these extended incidents might be mitigated, or how they're taken into consideration when you're deciding what fire response to implement?
Yeah, I guess I'll jump in again and let anybody else, if Josh wants to add anything. Smoke comes up all the time. Obviously, smoke's a huge concern, and I know from an agency administrator perspective, it's definitely an important topic that gets brought up early on in the incident. Even when this fire is small and expected to grow, we talk about that while we're going through the ISAP process and the strategic risk assessment, where smoke's kind of evaluated. How we mitigate that smoke is a little difficult. There's a lot of options on how we communicate that, which we lean on our public information officers and with some talking points. But a lot of times we will bring in what we call an air resource advisor, and they can be very helpful. Portraying that to the public. We also place smoke monitors out on the landscape on key sensitive areas, whether that's right in town, nursing homes, sensitive areas. We know we have sensitive people in every community. So it's a topic that gets brought up frequently and taken seriously. And we do everything we can to mitigate that or educate folks on where and how much smoke duration over time. It's a difficult thing. It's always discussed and brought up. And I'll stop there if anybody's got anything to add to that.
We have a little bit more time for questions that are already entered about advice for recommendations for setting up for success elsewhere, replicating this, some other things. But I'd like to take just a couple of moments in the meat of our Q&A session to give you the opportunity to talk about current events on the district that you were interested in mentioning. Is that something you still wanted to do? And how this relates to things that are happening in Pagosa now?
Are you talking about our current potential incident that we're bringing?
Yes.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'll go ahead and jump into that. It's kind of timely with this discussion. We actually have a great opportunity again. We had a fire that was discovered Monday afternoon and confirmed yesterday. Confirmed it was lightning caused, and this ignition happens to land in an area that hasn't seen fire in quite a while, but it is in a landscape that we intended to utilize for prescribed fire in the coming weeks, and actually had been planned for just northeast of Dolores, in the Haycamp Mesa area. So we have predetermined lines already established where this fire started. And we're currently building plans to bring in our local incident management team to manage this fire and utilize an indirect strategy similar that we did to several other fires in 2023 to bring fire out to control lines and predetermined control lines that have already been prepped. They're within a pod network, so potential operational delineations have already been laid out. And the conditions are perfect. It's an ideal location, one. So we talk about perfect timing, perfect place, right conditions. Resource availability is very good right now. So everything, we're kind of checking all the boxes. And so we've been given a great opportunity as of today moving forward. And yeah, that's kind of where we're at. So we're practicing as we speak, and once again, that alignment process that we developed, and I guess using ISAP, but really have an alignment with our agency administrators and our fire management across the forest, led us to this decision quickly, where it's not going to take days to make a decision. It's going to take hours to go through everything, and we made a decision, and we're moving forward. So,
and I'd like to jump in on the topic, because I feel like I was here about a year ago with the Dry Lake fire, where for public information, once again, okay, we've identified a small lightning caused fire. Right now, I think it's like in the 8 acre size range. And the go-to communications kit is, firefighters are on scene of a wildfire identified 13 miles northeast of Dolores, Colorado. Like action is being taken to suppress the fire, aircraft are on scene, the sort of like aggressive approach to fire suppression. And that is what the public has come to expect. And so now we have a situation where with any managed fire, I'm not speaking specifically about this one or any others I've been on, but where you say firefighters are on scene of an 8-acre wildfire and, what next? All of the narrative that we've been telling for years, the aggressive suppression strategy is no longer the language that we're using. We're now saying things like, I'm just looking at actually what we wrote yesterday about it. Fire managers are evaluating options for managing the lightning caused fire. And, we're starting to express larger and larger acreage as the days go on. The fire maps, what did those look like? Because we're not showing containment lines around the fire maps at this point. We're showing the footprint of the fire inside a containment box that's much, much larger. And so the tools that information officers are used to relying on no longer work. Our canned language, our canned maps, none of them apply in these scenarios. And so, I've been looking at some of the products being rolled out of Region 3, like the Coconino in the last couple of weeks has had a managed fire. And we're all stealing from each other. We're all sharing each other's strategies for how to communicate out the nuance of managed fire, because it's really hard to sort of flip the script and stop using that aggressive language. So I thought that would be helpful to call out, because I'm sure some people on this call have felt or are feeling that pain.
That really helps put a visualization to this whole process that you're talking about. You have this fire instead of the footprint, and oh my God, that's the footprint. It's okay, this event is happening in this larger thing that we've already defined and have a correct management for, or a plan for. That's very helpful. Before we move on much farther, I want to be sure to address a question for Dana. How important was it, or what difference did it make to have existing collaborative relationships, such as with the Quartz Ridge fire, that you could lean on to pull in a diversity of interest holders to talk about fire response process and find consensus and support? So
yeah, thanks,
collaborative
Gloria. I think that, we've talked a lot and we've heard staff from the San Juan National Forest say it's this concept of like, you don't dig a well when you're thirsty. You have to be present with your community in public service ahead of time. And there's this reciprocity and shared responsibility that occurs, but defining what that actually means can be kind of the key to the whole thing. Like, it's our community, it's everybody's responsibility to know their geography, to understand the role of fire in their environment, and to show up and ask hard questions of decision makers. And then on the flip side, it's really important that public servants and decision makers make themselves accessible and open to having those conversations, and show up in spaces where they are willing to change their mind and to take feedback, but also explain their thinking. And so, collaborative spaces where those relationships already exist and people feel comfortable picking up the phone or running into one another in the grocery store, or coming to a meeting. The San Juan made one of their ISAP decision-making process meetings open to people that wanted to come check that out. And, I think there's transparency, like Lo was talking about, and then there's also access. And then collaborative spaces create a lot of that access. A community member sitting next to a forest supervisor in a meeting is something that can be incredibly valuable. I also want to be careful, though. It's not like collaboratives and collaboration is going to solve all of our problems and the challenges that we're up against. And it's certainly not going to solve them quickly. We talk a lot about pace and scale in this world, and then pace and scale is not a thing in relationships. It's consistency that matters. And so there's some other structural challenges associated with agency and community relationships that can be really hard. And so understanding where you as an individual are as a public servant within that kind of cultural structure is really important, and listening and adjusting the way that you speak with the community, and then thinking about it, truly thinking about it as a we. You know, even just listening to this webinar, it's like the public is over here and we're over here. And the reality is we all live in these communities together and share the risks and share the smoke exposure and share all of these different elements of what we're experiencing. So I don't know if that's helpful, Gloria, but those are some of my thoughts.
Yeah, and kudos to you for expressing what often can be the elephant in the room with agency and public interactions, that it's, well, you know, we are managing our lands this way, and the public is coming in, and we need to be informed instead of our land is being managed this way, and we are all informing each other. So that's a really important thing to highlight. And that segues well into the next question that groups together a lot of tips and strategies and advice for replicating this elsewhere. So we're going to kind of summarize some of your questions. There are a lot of questions about how this can be replicated. Can you speak to setting up other locations for success? Speak to community trust, collaborative relationships, internal support. What specific steps could be used to set other places up for success with this?
I'll really quickly lead off, Gloria, with something really quickly, and that just to say that this fire ecologically, but then also your community partnerships are a practice of place. So we talk a lot about what's replicable, how do we make this work elsewhere, but if you're not working with and understanding the pulse of politics and culture and community, as well as the ecology in your area, it's just not going to be effective. So we want to replicate it, and I want to see other people kind of pushing on, you know, from an agency perspective and otherwise, pushing on the idea that we can change our minds and change the way that we communicate and put that into practice. Take responsibility for those outcomes, but it truly needs to be tailored to place, in my opinion.
Before the next panelist hops in, I wanted to share a comment that was really illustrative of this, where someone said they're not so much sure that the public cares about all the technical details of the decision making and where we decide to put the pods and all that stuff. They want to know more about, is it an undesirable destructive fire, or is it a beneficial fire? And that messaging seems to resonate with the public a lot more. So I don't know if that would guide any more of your discussions, your answers in the remaining minutes that we have. No more comments on PIOs or strategies for success for PIOs or other folks?
Well, was that specific to strategies for information, or was it replicability also from the management side?
Yeah, taking your process, in a few words, what tips would you give our listeners for setting themselves up for success?
Yeah, I guess I'll pitch in a couple, and then Pat and Josh, I think, can speak more toward the implementation side. But what I learned the hard way last year, with never having managed a fire on the San Juan, you know, for me as an info officer, having talking points, knowing your leader's intent. In my case, it was from my forest supervisor and how he wanted to communicate out about the fire, because I led with fuels reduction language and resource benefit language, because I was thinking wildfire crisis strategy, and that all of that is true, but it wasn't necessarily the reason we were suppressing the fire in the fashion we were. And so really thinking through with my leadership ahead of time would have behooved me about how we wanted to communicate out the balance of risk reduction versus resource benefit, and when it's appropriate to use which message. And so, you know, as far as like being prepared, having some talking points and understanding where your leadership sits with those things, it will really serve you well.
Okay, I'm handing this over to Rachel, who's also been monitoring Q&A. I'm sure you folks would like to listen to somebody else for a little bit. Rachel, what other thoughts and questions would you like to guide us towards?
Yeah, so we just have a couple of minutes left for folks who are available to stay online. If you want to keep the discussion going, we can keep it going for just a few minutes more. So I know that we've heard from Lo and from Dana. I am curious to hear maybe from Tracy, Pat, and Josh, just a little bit more about how this might be replicated elsewhere. You know, I know we're really putting it in the context of the San Juan National Forest, but for folks who are elsewhere in the country, elsewhere outside of the country, you know, what are some kind of actionable steps? What kind of support do you need to move forward with this kind of shift in thinking?
I'll start. I think, and it's based on some of the things that I would say were inadvertent successes that just happened, but then ended up being a big deal. And I'll give one quick example. We had at one point the governor in Colorado got very interested in our fires, to the point where I was a little worried about what was going to be said. But we had invited our the Department of Fire Prevention and Control folks early on in the process, and even though they had no, I wouldn't say need to be there, but there was no agency administrator needs from that group. There was nothing burning on private at the time, but having them in the room, particularly for this ISAP process and understanding the decision making, they headed that challenge off without it ever reaching down to my level, which was pretty inadvertently happened. But to me, it spoke to the first thing I'll say is invite participation early, even from the appropriate stakeholders, appropriate partners, because you don't know when they're going to be able to bail you out of a situation and basically make it not a situation. The other thing, I mean, Dana has touched on it pretty significantly. We have a very informed community that is largely the benefit of some of our collaborative work that folks like Dana are working on. And those relationships, the investment in those relationships from a ranger or a agency administrator in the case of fire, when the fire happens, pays off dividends. And I'll say even with like the communication and relationship with our local sheriffs was made this really pretty easy. And those two factors, I think, you know, were really part of the success story here. And it wasn't all roses on like Chris Mountain. And we actually met with the sheriff about some of the decisions on that helped inform what we did in the future. But those two pieces, and just acknowledging, I think Dana said it best, that it isn't necessarily replicatable everywhere. Some people do not have the political environment. They don't have the resource condition to be able to, you know, talk about, you know, a fire moving beyond a small footprint. You know, they're in the backyard of a large community perhaps, and it's just not, the space is not there. It might show up later, but it's not right now. So that place and time and understanding the environment you're in is, I guess, the third piece I would say is replicatable success.
Yeah, that's good. And just some additions to that. You know, I think it's fairly simple. And like Josh said, you can't replicate it everywhere. We're lucky enough in the San Juan to have a large landscape of, you know, particularly, below 8,500 feet is a ponderosa pine ecosystem that is very fire dependent. Where we want to allow fire in the landscape, and that's part of our jobs, and we should be doing that. So it comes down to me is really mindset, leadership that leads to alignment. And it's those three things. The process is there. ISAP, the RMA dashboard, backing up your decisions with the analytics, and then going through a strategic risk assessment. Those three things can get you in alignment pretty quickly. And I would encourage folks to obviously not do that, or not wait to do that, or not wait to talk about that when there's smoke in the air. And that happens in the preseason. And that's pretty important to build and gain that trust on where you think you're going to go. And then when there's smoke in there, the plan's in place and it's kicked off from there. So.
And that's kind of a good segue to what I would say. So they're talking 10, 20,000 foot view here on that. I would take that down to more of an operational level. Again, have those conversations preseason with your folks. Train your folks, train your GS3s on up to the whys, and show them the videos, show them webinars like this, and start to explain the benefits. So that's where I would take it from my perspective.
All right, thank you all so much. And I do want to respect everybody's time. I know that we're over the top of the hour here. So to our panelists, if you're able to stay on just a little longer, we invite you to. If you have to drop off, no problem. To everyone online, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you to Lo, Tracy, Dana, Pat, Josh, and to Mike Caggiano, Natalie Cooper, and some other folks who all made this happen today. I know that this is just the beginning of the conversation. This is really just a starting point. And I'm sure that we'll be having some rich dialogue moving forward as well. So if you guys are able to answer just one more question. We had a good one wondering, what are the potential concerns for the agency or staff if fires get away and could cause damage to private property? So essentially, when you're making these decisions, how do you take private property into consideration? Knowing that we've already talked about, having a working relationship with nearby landowners, having those collaborative connections.
I mean, I think you're kind of describing the thing that as an agency administrator makes me stay up at night thinking about these decisions. And not just, I would say, even like igniting a prescribed fire, anything we do when we're involving fire, which has some uncertainty when we use it. It is not a 100% predictable tool. It's something that we think about pretty seriously from the decision maker standpoint, and it does weigh into our decision. To answer specifically about like how we treat private property, very often when we speak about values at risk that we're weighing in our decision-making process, that's one of the first things on that values at risk list, particularly if it's got homes or structures on it, things like that. So that's the primary way we really factor in that weight of what do we do in this with the strategy in this particular instances around that value at risk discussion as part of the process.
Alrighty, we'll go ahead and wrap it up, leave it there. Again, I wanted to thank you all so much for taking the time today. And this recording will be available within about a week. We'll be sharing out a lot of the resources that folks are posting in the chat as well. So thank you so much. And thanks to Gloria and the Southern Rockies Fire Science Network for co-hosting with the Southwest Fire Science Consortium, Rocky Mountain Research Station, and San Juan National Forest today.
And I've put links in the end of the chat for our exchanges. So that's one of the best ways to follow up and keep track of outcomes from the event. To sign up for the newsletters for the Southern Rockies Fire Science Network and the Southwest Fire Science Consortium. And please feel free to reach out to myself, gloria.edwards@colorado-state.edu, and Rachel Bean or Southwest Fire Science Consortium if you have any questions. We'll be sharing resources. Thank you, everyone.